a Dogma lesson, just not bothering to plan? That's a question for TEFLologists. When I read this book, is it better to skim or scan? That's a question for TEFLologists. Can you be a good teacher if you have a CELTA? Or should you invest in an MA or a Delta? From politics to methodology, we'll discuss them all on TEFLology. Welcome to another interview episode of TEFLology. Earlier this month, Matt and Matthew spoke to Lindsay Clandfield and Luke Meddings over Skype about ELT Publishing. Luke Meddings is known for his contributions to Dogma ELT and unplugged approaches to teaching. Lindsay Clandfield is a prolific writer, known for his blogging and textbooks, as well as his presentations at TEFL and other conferences. Matt and Matthew spoke to them about their work on The Round, an independent ELT publishing collective. Please enjoy the podcast.
Okay, so we're joined by Luke Meddings and Lindsay Clandfield. We're not actually all together today. Luke is over in London, and we're joined by Lindsay in Spain, and we're coming to you from Japan. Okay, so very briefly, perhaps we'll just begin by, if you could tell us how you came to know each other or work with each other.
First of all, hi guys. Luke, you want to...
I seem to remember meeting you on a staircase in Tenerife, Lindsay.
That's true.
Yes, we met. Is that the first time we met? It's the first kind of conversation.
I think so. We met, Tenerife in the Canary Islands in Spain. We were both there for a conference. That must have been now more than 10 years ago.
Right.
Yeah.
Okay. Yeah.
Actually, if you wouldn't mind going a little further back, maybe just a quick background about your careers as teachers and teacher trainers.
Okay. I started teaching in. I got certified in Canada. I'm a Canadian-born British citizen, I guess, so dual nationality. But I grew up in Canada, became a teacher in Canada, started teaching in Mexico at a university, then moved to Spain, where I continued teaching and became a teacher trainer. And I began my writing career in Spain, in Barcelona. I lived in Barcelona for many years before moving south to just outside Alicante in Spain, and started writing around 12 or 13 years ago, probably a bit more, maybe almost 15 years ago, and have been still teaching and doing training ever since.
Right. And you?
Well, I qualified, I did the CELTA in 1987, and taught for around 15 years straight in London, with one gap where I went to be deputy editor of the English Language Gazette, the EO Gazette. And I started writing quite quickly. I started writing reviews of books for BBC English Magazine in the early 90s. And then I spent 2 years at the English Language Gazette. And so gradually the writing started to be, kind of an important part of my ELT life. And I got a column writing for The Guardian around 2003, 2004. And I think that was the subject of my first conversation with Lindsay, actually.
Okay.
I think it was, yeah. Have you ever noticed, guys, when we talk about our teaching, it almost sounds like we're talking about like serving time. Like I did a 15-year stint in London, and Lindsay served a little bit of time in a few years in Mexico before being transferred over to Spain. It always strikes me that way. So when we talk about teaching.
I know what you mean, but there's always that funny thing of once you stop teaching regularly, you're always desperate to get back to the classroom.
Yeah,
when I've done that, it's always been a very happy experience, I must say. When I was managing a school, which I hadn't mentioned, I was always very happy when teachers were sick, because it meant I could stop managing and go and teach again.
Yeah.
Right, I see, yeah. Perhaps first we'd like to ask you about your work at The Round, and maybe for our listeners who aren't familiar with The Round, perhaps you could give a very brief description of what you're doing.
Okay, I can start that. The Round was something Luke and I, as we started out, we'd met at a conference and then, started corresponding a little bit together. And I think we first worked together on the book Teaching Unplugged, right, Luke?
Yeah, that's right.
Yep. So I was the series editor for the Delta Teacher Development Series, and one of the first books we commissioned in that series was Luke and Scott's book on Dogma, because nothing had been done on that in a book format. Yeah. And so we worked together for, I think, a couple of years on that, or at least a year and a half on that book.
It was a good 2 years, I think, yeah.
Yeah, and when that finished, we'd enjoyed the experience, and a few months later, we decided to work together again. And we originally were going to do an ebook that we were going to self-publish, which would be an ebook full of all the kinds of activities that I, writing for a mainstream publisher, had not been able to put into books, and that Luke had been interested in through Dogma and other kind of critical approaches to teaching. So we wanted to do a book full of those kind of activities, and there was no way a publisher was going to take it on. So we decided to do it ourselves. And we were going to do it originally as a blog. Then we figured out how we could do it as an ebook. But then we thought, why just do it by ourselves? Why not use this as a launching point? Because we saw other people were beginning to self-publish. We also saw that lots of people were giving away lots of stuff free online, which is fine, like the writers and teachers sharing ideas. That's all great, but we're beginning to think, isn't there a kind of middle way by which people can write and share ideas and get money for it without having to go via a big publisher who will charge a lot more? So we decided to set up this kind of collective, which we called The Round, and our book was the first one. And we made 3 principles for it, which was, one, it had to be great for educators. So we wanted books and products in there that teachers would love, and that were affordable for teachers. So the book we wrote was €5, or $6.50. I think it still is more or less that price.
Okay.
And we wanted it to be fair for authors. And by self-publishing, even if you distribute through giants such as Amazon or other self-publishing things, the percentage you get as a writer is far bigger. A writer will get 70% off the cover price of a book for Amazon, and in other places up to 80%. Whereas writing for a big publisher, the author gets 10%. And the publisher gets the rest. And we wanted it to be a learning environment. So once we had gone through that with our book, we then invited other people, and we mentored them through the process of getting an ebook out, or a product out in the round, and then they undertake to mentor the next person that comes in, and so on. Sorry, Luke, I'll let you add anything that you want to that.
Well, yeah, I think there are a couple of things to do with the publishing process that were very important from the start. We both worked as editors. Lindsay is a series editor, and myself at the English Language Gazette. And so we were both very conscious of the benefits of being edited as a writer. One of the kind of maxims that I learned at the EL Gazette, it's one of the kind of first rules of journalism, is that you can't edit your own work because you're too close to it.
Yeah.
And so even the best journalists will have their work sub-edited by someone else. And we felt that for a start, we were looking at a lot of very interesting blogs around that time. This is 3 or 4 years ago now. And we were thinking that it would be interesting to have some of those blogs collected in book form. And then we realized that an ebook was an achievable way of doing that. But also that this process of the publishing being a learning community or a learning environment would mean that writers who had hitherto been purely self-publishing would then get some experience of the editing process. And so hopefully their writing would be, honed or polished to a certain extent.
You mean,
and that's part of the kind of quality control side of things, because if you like, at the extreme, self-publishing, there's no quality control. It's just what you produce, and that may be kind of raw and brilliant, or it may be raw and in need of a bit of attention. And on the other extreme, you have publishing, where there's a great deal of help to the author, great deal of direction in terms of the initial idea to publish book, and we want to have something like a middle way where there was some of the immediacy of self-publishing, where you could have niche content, but where also there was this quality control in terms of the editing process. And so, it isn't a free for all. It's very much about what ideas that we think are strong, and then helping the authors make the best of their own ideas.
I see. And how did you choose the first few authors?
Well, we'd been following people on certain people on blogs. This was around 3 or 4 years ago, and I think if we go back a bit further, there was a period there, and I've heard lots of people talk about this, that was almost is being considered now almost like there was a little mini golden age of blogging for a while within the ELT community, I think. Around 6 years ago, there was when everybody suddenly discovered it. And I remember talking to lots of people who were following lots of blogs, and it's kind of died down a bit. There's still lots of good blogging going on, but there isn't this sort of explosion where it all felt new and wonderful and lots of things. So how did we choose? We went to a few people and asked them if they were interested. Some of them said yes. Some of them said yes and published with us. So, for example, Scott Thornbury did a collection of his blog stuff. Some of them said yes and didn't end up getting the book done. I think there's a big gap between saying I want to write a book and actually writing a book. Anyway, so there was a big gap between actually saying that you're going to do a book and doing a book. That's one thing I've learned as an editor and a series editor. Almost like if I had a nickel for every time someone said, I've got a really good idea for a book, I want to talk to you about it. And sometimes they're good ideas, sometimes they're horrendous ideas. But even like the ideas which I've been really excited about, I said, no. At the beginning, I used to think, it's just easy, they'll just do it. And then there'd be like 6 months would go by, and I'd be emailing this person, and I'd like, no, I know, I just can't get around to it or whatever. So it's like for every 5 really good ideas that sometimes we hear about or neat blog posts where we talk to the person, maybe only one kind of goes through with that process. Right. And then once we had 2 or 3 people in there, other people started, we had a social media campaign, and slowly it's just kind of been taking care of itself. So people have sent in submissions. I should add that more things get turned down than get accepted at the round, or maybe it's half and half. But the process of accepting something is usually done by a proposal is circulated to various authors in the round. So the authors themselves then get votes on, do you think this has legs? Do you think this is interesting, original, and so on and so forth? And if people say yes, then we go forward with it. People say, no, this is too much like this, or this is not original at all, or it's not very well written. We might ask the person to resubmit, or we might say, look, give us another idea. This one isn't gonna work.
Yeah.
Okay. And
so I'm back, guys, and that's another part of the kind of quality control process. This kind of sort of intermediate process between self-publishing and full publishing. And I don't know if Lindsay may have mentioned it just now. But another aspect to the sort of intermediate territory we occupy between self-publishing and traditional publishing is that the author retains their own royalties. So there's quality control both in the commissioning process, as Lindsay's just described, and in the editing process, as I was stressing earlier. And then once the book is published, unusually. I don't know if it's unique, but it's certainly extremely unusual in our field. Having been through a professional publishing process, the author still retains royalties of their own book, and the author is essentially the one who decides whether or not the round is working for them and whether they want to stay within that shared environment.
Right. And could you maybe talk a bit about the response you've had to your books? If the profile of a typical round reader, or
well, one of the first things that we did was one of the missions that we had was first to allow unpublished people to get published, and through mentoring and help. So we had some kind of name authors like Scott Thornbury or Nikki Hockley or other people who had published other books, but then they were also helping new people get stuff. So we had several new authors coming on board as well. The reaction has been really, really good. I mean, there's been lots of positive things about it.
Yeah.
But one of the other things was that one of the missions of the round was to publish. We were interested in books that were niche as well. So the thing with the big publishers is they often, to make it financially viable for them, they need to appeal to as many people as possible. So books for teachers tend to sell very little. There are some, I know as an editor for a series myself, sometimes we've had proposals where I think, that would be a great chapter, but it's not a book.
Yeah.
But with ebook publishing, that chapter can be a book. You just price it accordingly. You just make it a 99-cent book or a $1.99 book. And it's, so for example, Nikki Hockley's webinars, which is at the round, would in any other publisher probably warrant a chapter. Of a book which would cost like $20 or $30.
Right.
But she could write it herself and sell it for $5. And it's a perfectly easy thing to pick up with all the tips on how to do a webinar, how to set up, run, troubleshoot, etc. webinars for educators. Our book that we did was called 52, A Year of Subversive Activity. Wouldn't have been picked up by any publisher. Had only 52 activities. We priced it again at around $5 or $6.
Yeah.
So... yeah, go on.
Well, I was just going to say that there's been quite a lot of debate recently on social media, and partly prompted by an article in The Guardian about the so-called parsnips maxim within ELT Publishing. And that was one of the things that we addressed in our kind of explicitly in the little book 52 that we wrote. So yeah, I think that's something we are proud of.
Yeah. And I think but the profile of the typical round reader is probably the same profile of someone who would be attracted to TEFLology.
Okay.
We'd hope so.
I mean, people who like teaching, who know, who are over halfway through a life sentence in teaching, as I was talking about before, who've decided it is their vocation, who enjoy it, who are interested in new and original ideas and stuff like that. Some of the things we have on the round are really niche. So there's books on machinima, like making videos in Second Life. So that's a really niche market of language. There are other ones which are like using apps for business English. So these kind of little type things. I'm trying to think of other titles, Luke, that would come under that the niche aspect.
Well, you've got English clubs.
How to set up English language clubs at schools, universities, things like that.
You've got activities. Machinima is one. Reading communities.
Yeah.
And we shouldn't forget when we survey our titles, Lindsay's latest collaboration, English for the Zombie Apocalypse.
Yeah, that's just we had a question.
All the big publishers wanted it.
Yeah.
So there was a real kind of food fight between the big 3 or 4. And Lindsay said, no, zombies could be mainstream, but we're going to keep it niche.
So how?
We're going to keep it real with the round.
So how has that been accepted by the learners? Have you had any sort of success stories with learners being really
for the zombie apocalypse?
Yeah.
Apocalypse? Oh yeah. High school students.
Right. Okay.
High school students who are totally into The Walking Dead. Even like the younger ones. I taught it at my son's high school. I taught a lesson, and it was really well accepted. Had some very funny outcomes. One of the little speaking activities at the end is they have to match one of the lessons. They have to match prepositions to places for the best places to hide. So things like up a tree, under a car, things like that. Then they have to make a dialogue where one person is hidden somewhere and so on. It led to this huge debate of like where good places to hide from zombies are. We also had, I've heard from several teachers, but mostly though with secondary school students. That seems to be where people have seen the most interest in it. I of course think it could be sold to anyone, anywhere. Well, we built it in kind of tongue-in-cheek as like the only English book you'll ever need when the chips are down. This is like, forget everything else. This is the only one you'll need. But anyway.
That's a good selling point.
Yeah. Because when the zombie apocalypse comes, we know everyone's going to be speaking English. It's in all the movies, video games, and anything. You don't hear them speaking any other language.
Exactly.
So,
and Headway doesn't address it yet. So
no, nobody else has, surprisingly enough. So,
yeah. And
I think, Lindsay, is it worth talking a little bit about the team we have at the round, like Mark and Christina. So one of the things we wanted to do from the start, we felt was an opportunity, given that this was in our hands, was to have some nice covers and a kind of lively feel to the graphics. And we were fortunate enough to work with Mark Bain from the very start. He designed our website and has designed all of our covers to date. And his work on the website and on the covers has helped us to have a really strong, lively visual feel. A lot of conventional publishers still use stock library shots for their covers. And the feel of these books, however exciting the content is very dry.
Tell me how many mainstream publisher books for teachers have like interesting covers. Usually they're either a stock photo or just like just a single block color. I mean, they're very unimaginative in that.
Yeah. 2 colors if you're lucky, but
2 colors if you're lucky. Yeah. There was a point where I think OUP had this horrible like orange and brown theme for their books. It's like totally 70s. I still have some of them, but they've rebranded them now. So there was Mark Bain, and then we also have Christina Rebuffit-Broadus, who helps us with. She answers authors. She does some of our social media. She's always at TEFL, representing the round for when we can't make it, and she's usually the first person that people will hear from when they write to the round.
Okay. And is it common for all of you to be in a room together, or is it kind of like this? Is it over the internet?
It's like
tends
like
to
this.
be like this.
Yes. We have our little Skype office, our WhatsApp office, our well, we just do it all virtually, pretty much. Although Luke and I do meet each other from time to time at conferences. We're meeting each other.
When we find ourselves meeting face to face, it's extremely exciting, and we tend to send selfies and that sort of thing just to prove we did it.
Right. Okay.
Yes.
Perhaps changing the topic slightly. In our title song, so we asked the question: Is a Dogma lesson not bothering to plan? Of course, we don't think that at all. Obviously, however, what would you say to some of these people who have, I guess, kind of criticised Dogma as being perhaps less professional, perhaps, for want of a better word, or?
Are you addressing me?
I'm going to leave this to Luke. I think so.
We can open it up to both. I guess. Yeah.
I think.
Luke.
I mean, I would point out that the round doesn't have a kind of Dogma mission.
Right.
It obviously has a flavour in certain titles, and I would say in the ethos of kind of a startup, there are parallels there. But there's a great range of writing that we have published and will continue to publish. I think Dogma, like any other approach, and I certainly think it's fair to call it an approach, can be used in a professional or an unprofessional way. Course books can be used brilliantly, very professionally, with great imagination and commitment, or they can be used very, very lazily and with very little effort to bring them to life. And we've all witnessed teachers doing both of those things and all kinds of grades in between, and possibly been those teachers using course books imaginatively or rather lazily. And I think the same is true of any approach, and I think the same is true of Dogma. It can, yes, you could take it as an idea that allows you to breeze in and teach off the cuff. But actually, if you read up, you'll see that there's no let up. You might do less rigorous lesson planning, but you would then do some pretty rigorous lesson reporting afterwards. It's very demanding in the moment because you're responding to what comes up and you're making decisions on the cuff, both of which are good things to do as teachers. I just think it's like any other approach. It can be done well or not so well.
Yeah. As you pointed out, the round isn't specifically there to promote Dogma. Maybe the similarity.
Yeah, I would say we wanted to make sure, because there was a danger of that at the beginning, because Luke's name was on the round.
Yeah.
We were very worried that it would be considered as Dogma clearinghouse.
Right.
And so we had several offers of books. Okay, so Luke's doing this and but what the curious thing is that I'm a course book author, so we should actually kind of hate each other, and we've written nasty things about each other in an abstract way, not personally. But go on. Sorry, go on.
I was just
I think our lawyers have tracked down all those personal things, Lindsay. They're off the internet. They'll never be seen again.
Maybe the one commonality would be, and especially looking at the book that the two of you wrote together, is this subversiveness. Do you feel that kind of subversiveness? Do you feel a subversive movement within the ELT world?
I don't know. I think there is a certain desire for the whole area of the blandness of course books is often a rallying point for teachers. But this has been around, I think, since the 70s. I mean, Mary and Velukri and that kind of generation of people were saying the same kind of things. They were expressing the same kind of frustration. If anything, that frustration against the blandness has gotten worse as publishers became more and more international and books spread more and more. Like the spread of a book like Headway, when we consider the amount of sales that has around all corners of the world, and what that means for publishing such a book to keep those markets happy, means that a lot of things have to be left out, and how all the other books want to kind of follow that success. So there is a movement in that respect. I think also there is the beginning of a movement of kind of subversiveness or frustration with, if it's not course books now, there's a beginning with some of the tech stuff that's happening. So as more and more universities, starting with universities, but schools and so on, are beginning. First, it was interactive whiteboards. That was sometimes resisted, but not kind of problematized as much as some of the things happening with learning environments now, with people beginning to feel a bit frustrated by that, and so there may be the beginnings of more subversiveness on the tech level, and also that we're all able to communicate with each other far more easily now than we were before, so we can get a better idea of what's going on. But as a whole,
I think another area which is interesting is that I think you have a kind of dual. Two things happening at once in a way. I think from the top down, you have an increased emphasis on standardization, on testing. There's a lot of corporate activity, especially in the tech market. There's a strong sense, within the broader public education systems of the US and the UK, that business models are the ones to apply to schools that are struggling. And I think that kind of standardized, test-oriented corporate approach, which is often adopted by policymakers within government, is very much at odds with the more kind of bottom-up approach that I think the round does represent, which is absolutely, as Lindsay's just suggested, made possible by the fact that we can communicate with each other, that we can publish ideas readily without needing to print off things and keep them in warehouses. And people are doing this all the time, and they're sharing their own ideas. So it's almost as if there's a kind of top-down wave of strategy, which is sort of almost out of the hands of us teachers. And I think for all that we joked about life sentences, I'm sure Lindsay and myself still see ourselves as teachers, as well as writers and publishers and so on. And so in response to that, or at the same time as that, you've got this strong, sort of self-generating movement where people are creating their own material and sharing it and exploring platforms which allow students to do the same. So I think there's a lot happening at the same time, but I would certainly think the round represents the bottom-up side of things there.
Yeah. Okay. And do you see that as a potential future? I mean, maybe in a similar way to other industries, for example, music or comedy or things where the bottom up seems to be, I'm sure it's not overtaking, but seems to be representing a big chunk of what's out there for people now.
Well, I think it's very interesting that when we look at the titles that are doing best at the round, I mean, Lindsay may be better placed to outline this, but that the authors are doing better with those titles than we think they would be doing with similar titles that they publish with regular conventional publishers. So I think when you get it right, I think that starts to become both a sort of viable and attractive idea, but also viable in terms of giving authors control over their own work and being rewarded for it. Lindsay, do you want to say any more on that?
Well, yeah, let's just look at the economics of one of the round books, for example. If we look at books for teachers, I don't know how much they cost in Japan, your books for teachers from a big publisher. In England, they might cost like £24. I don't know, $20 to $30 would be reasonable price. Is that more or less in Japan too?
Probably a little bit more.
A little bit more.
A little bit more. Yeah, a little bit more. Okay, so let's just take as $25 as our starting point. I've written books for teachers with Delta Publishing. Let's say it was $25, of which I get 10%. So I get of the net receipt that the publisher gets. So the publisher sells it to the bookseller, who sells it at a discount, who gets a discount of 40%. So from the $25, there's $18 coming back to the publisher, of which I get $1.80. Okay, so that would be what I would earn off of that book.
Right.
And the customer pays $25. On the book that I wrote with Luke, which we sell at $6, Luke and I get, what was it, $4? Yeah, $4. So I get more on a book that sells for $6 than on a book that sells for $25.
Right. Yeah.
So if your book is popular, and definitely I think we've made more on the 52 book than we would have made with a traditional publisher. Other authors who are the books that are doing well in the round have definitely made more for the author. So it's a kind of win-win situation in that respect.
Perhaps maybe moving the focus slightly towards the learners now.
Yep.
I mean, how has social media enhanced the classroom for the learners? I remember, Luke, you gave a presentation about being both unplugged and connected a couple of years back. Not sure if you remember.
Of course I do, yeah. Thanks.
So I'm wondering if you could just kind of describe how learners can be connected, but also teachers can adopt an unplugged approach too.
Well, I think, as I said, with thinking about Dogma as an approach, if one thinks of technology as a tool, in the broadest sense, there's a whole range of tools. It can be used, positively, negatively. It can be used, in a kind of conscious and worthwhile way, and in a lazy and unhelpful way. And the way I see social media and digital platforms working with unplugged teaching is essentially as a means of expression and a means of capturing emergent language as you go along. It's very powerful. And it's a very necessary feature of unplugged teaching to have outputs that contain the learner's own language, that contain some kind of summary from the teacher of organizing or referring what's come up in class to the syllabus and so on. And digital platforms can be used to do that. They can be used to collect the learner's work. They can be used to, for example, give learners in a monolingual environment where there's a special need to speak English outside the classroom, a reason and the opportunity to speak via Skype in the way that we're doing now to learners or classes in other countries, and to use English for genuine communicative purposes. So I think there are lots of areas in which the two can be combined, and where there can be synergy between the two, if you like. But equally, if you use an interactive whiteboard just to deliver coursebook content, or if your main interest is in websites that are very carefully controlled by publishers to support coursebooks, then there may be less room for the learners themselves. So
or even I'm gonna say something that'll probably piss off some people out there who But there's the difference between using like technology in the way that Luke is talking about for outputs, for communicating. I mean, for example, I've got a group of students now, and we've got a WhatsApp. I don't know if that's popular in Japan. It's very popular in Spain. Yeah. A WhatsApp group where we have daily English challenges, where people are chatting or answering a question, and we kind of work through that. That's very different than, for example, me assigning all my students Duolingo, which is. A bit controversial. I'm not a huge fan. I think Duolingo can work great for like the first couple of weeks or for beginners, but that's not about real communication or anything. And in fact, if you look at some of the Duolingo sentences, they're pretty awful. They may be getting better or whatever, but there's a whole host of things like that. But those are two different kinds of using tech. If I just said to everyone here, we got a blended course. You'll have face-to-face classes with me, and then you're going to use Duolingo. I would suggest that that's probably a lazy way of doing a blended course, because I'm just surrendering all of that stuff to the software. Yeah. Just as if I'd said, I've got an app which has 2,900 grammar exercises which auto mark and which I can give you badges and points and whatever for, but I don't have to do anything. That's a bit of a cop out for sort of communicative or meaningful stuff. It can be fun. I'm not saying it's not fun. It can, and that's why I know people say, but I love Duolingo. Sure, but it's not the same as like teaching and communicating and outputs and so on.
Yeah. I think another interesting point, which it interests me from a Dogma perspective, but I think it must be of interest to all teachers, because it's something which is changing our understanding of what the different skills are, which is just thinking of how do we communicate in our everyday life. One way we communicate is like this on Skype or on FaceTime, all these ways that we communicate with people in different buildings, different towns, different countries, and so on. But another thing is that so much of our conversation these days is done as a kind of chat or as writing, as Lindsay said. WhatsApp or Facebook, closed Facebook groups can be very powerful because they allow people to write pretty much in the way they chat, and yes, the written form is different from the spoken form, but it's not a kind of formal discourse or register specific kind of task. Write a letter or write an essay or write XYZ. It's just, talking via text. And I think that's a really interesting development. And of course, the texts then are captured because they're digital, and you can look at them and you can analyze the language, and the teacher can help with it. So, it's a sort of way of freezing interaction in a way, so that you freeze framing it so that you can look at the language, as well as, of course, allowing people simply to communicate.
Yeah. That's great. I think we're going to have to wrap things up there, if that's okay.
That's fine. Sorry.
It's been great. Can I just say a couple of things?
Sure.
Lindsay might want to add something. I want to say thanks to you guys for inviting us to be on the podcast. And I'd really like to urge our listeners, your listeners, to go to the round site, to look at the titles page, and to buy a couple of books. They're deliberately priced low so that they're affordable to teachers. They're deliberately made ebooks so that people don't have to wait months for a print book to arrive. And our structure is that the money goes almost entirely to the authors. We're not benefiting from this. We're not profiting from it. It really is a collective, and it's about being part of the wider community of teachers and educators. And so I just would urge people, look at those price points and kind of, give the authors a chance, buy the book, and let us know what you think of it. There are lots of ways to feedback in social media and on the website. So that's my little kind of plug, but it's almost a plea to say, we've set this up, do get involved, and one way to get involved is by buying those books.
Yep.
And what would you say to would-be writers?
Send us your ideas. There are submission guidelines on the round. We're always interested to hear, and I'm sure some of your listeners, if you're a listener to TEFLology, then you're already in it for the good you're in it for good. It's your vocation, I'm assuming, which means you probably have some good ideas, and maybe you have an itch that needs scratching. And they say that everybody should plant a tree, have a baby, and write a book in this life. So if you've done one or two of those others, and or if you haven't, and you want to do one of those three things, maybe writing a book would be something you could do this year. It's January, so it's like a New Year's resolution.
Yeah, great. I think that's a great message to finish on. So thank you very much, Lindsay and Luke.
Thank you very much.
Yeah.
Okay.
Thank you for listening to this week's podcast. We hope you enjoyed the interview. If you'd like to contact us, please send an email to teflology@gmail.com, or you can follow us on Twitter @teflology. We'll be back with a regular episode soon.